Welcome to our series, Back to the Garden, 5 Ways to Ruin Your Life. You're still here, which is a good thing. Hopefully we're all wanting not to ruin our lives, and so we're wanting to cue in ways to not make that happen. We've looked so far in the series, the first 2 ways to ruin our life. The first way was to put yourself first, kind of make life all about you. Last week was the second way that we can ruin our life, which is to become a consumer, not a contributor. Today we're going to look at the third way to ruin our life, which is to never rest, to never rest. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 2. You can kind of make your way there. There have been a number of controversies over the last few years in professional sports. One of the controversies that was a little bit unforeseen happened within the NBA, and it was over something called load management. And if you're not familiar with that term or that phrase, the idea behind load management is that players try to manage the load or the stress that they carry. So in terms of like the number of games they play and their practice schedule and their training and their travel. And what they're finding is that there is this balance that they need between work and rest. And exercise physiologists, kind of medical community, they're honing in on this idea that if a player works all the time, they're going to be much more prone to have overuse injuries and to find themselves kind of sidelined because they've not stepped back and rested. And so they don't want to rest all the time or they get lazy and out of shape. But if they're always working and always pushing, there's a chance that they're not going to be able to finish well. Now, the reason that's controversial is because if a fan shows up to see Kawhi Leonard, and Kawhi Leonard is sitting on the bench as opposed to playing, they want him playing, they want him working, they want him doing something, and it raises kind of a tension that all of us feel. Perhaps we're not NBA athletes, but we all have to wrestle with this tension. It's the question, how do we find the right balance between work and rest? How do we find a healthy rhythm where we don't go to one extreme and we're resting and we're lazy, but we don't go to the other extreme where we're constantly on the go and constantly busy? We find that there's value, there is health in being a worker, in being productive. We saw last week in Genesis 1:28 this creation or dominion mandate. God has told us, go be fruitful and multiply. And there's this idea that we're to be productive people. They're familiar with like the Protestant work ethic and this idea that we're to be industrious. And so we kind of pride ourselves in that. But what I want to talk to you about today is the other reality. The other reality is that there's a dark side, actually, when we don't have any kind of load management, when we're always pushing, when we're always going, when we're always trying to produce. If I ask you this kind of basic question, and we have this conversation on a number of ways, how have you been? The answer I know that you're not going to give me. And it's like you're not going to tell anybody this. You're not going to say to anyone, you know what, I have been really rested. Right, and so those of you, by the way, if you're a mom and you have like young kids right now, you are officially excused from feeling any sense of guilt about anything I say from here on. But for the rest of us, we need to cue into this. You're not going to say, and when's the last time you've said, I just feel so rested? I feel energized, I feel rejuvenated, I feel refreshed. Like that's not what you ever say. What is it that you tend to say? I'm busy, right? And somebody has once said that if the devil can't make you bad, he'll make you busy. And so what's happened is kind of busyness, though we wear it as a badge of honor. I'm busy. That means I'm productive and I'm doing things and I'm accomplishing things. The reality is that when busyness kind of becomes a badge of honor and that becomes the way that we live, it ends up stressing us emotionally to the point that we're kind of always on edge, and we're short and impatient and rude, and it affects us physically. I mean, all kinds of research has been done in the area of overwork and stress, and it affects our blood pressure, our inability to sleep. It even affects the way that we store fat. There's all kinds of negative byproducts and consequences of this busyness and always on the go, and ultimately it affects us spiritually. I was having a conversation a number of years ago with a group of adults and just asked them this question, like, what is it that keeps you from enjoying God? Like just kind of being in his presence, being aware and mindful. The number one most consistent answer was this: busyness. Busyness, busyness. And so we just asked the question this morning, what is the right balance, the healthy balance between work and between rest? If you open to Genesis chapter 2, we're going to begin at verse 1. We're going to look at verses 1 through 3. And in these verses, we find God giving us a healthier balance, a healthier rhythm between work and between rest. And so in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 2, we find, thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. By the seventh day, notice this, God completed his work. So God's not lazy. He's not incompetent. He's not just kind of sitting on the sidelines letting everybody else take care of him. God completed his work, which he had done, and I want you to see this, and he rested. He rested. He rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done, and then he does something with this seventh day. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So we've already seen that good, productive, contributing work is affirmed as a godly thing. Here we find that rest is also affirmed as a good and a godly thing. Now I would ask you to note two things about this particular passage here. This rest that God models for us, it is done before sin enters the world. So God resting was not in response to sin. It was just God embedding into creation this very healthy thing that we need in our lives. It is to rest. It was also given not only before sin, it was given before the law. So this principle, this idea of God resting is not something that we find if you say, well, this is something that was just in the law and I don't have to do it today because it was in law. I would just encourage you to consider God said this was a good idea before the law. And so if you think about what we're reading here, I would remind you of words of a man named Gordon MacDonald. He said this. He said, we do not rest because our work is done. We rest because God commanded it, and hear this, and created us to have a need for it. And so the central truth is just simply this, is that both work and rest are part of God's created order. If we go on, you can read in Exodus at some point, chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, when God gives the Ten Commandments. This command that is given is not a command here, but it's given as a command in the Ten Commandments. And in that section, the phrase is this, to remember the Sabbath. Interestingly, that's the only one of the Ten Commandments where God says, remember something. He doesn't say, remember, honor your parents, remember to keep not take the Lord's name in vain. But he says, remember the Sabbath. He's calling back to this timeless principle that God embedded into, he wove into the fabric of creation and the fabric of our bodies. The fabric of our lives, of our emotional, our physical abilities and capabilities. He embedded this into us, so we're to remember the Sabbath. And then he does the same thing in Exodus 20 as he does here. There are two adjectives that he uses to describe this day. He says, first of all, it is blessed. That is, that there is a special blessing. It's not a curse. Jesus will come later and say, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. This idea of resting is something that God gave to us as a gift. So it is blessed, but then he says it is also sanctified, which essentially means that it is holy, it is set apart. This day is to be distinct and different from other days. It is sanctified, it is to be set apart. Now, here's how he does not explain and describe this day of rest, this Sabbath. And this might be some of our experience here. He doesn't say that this is what a blessed and sanctified day looks like. He doesn't say that you wake up tired from a fitful night's sleep, immediately dreading the long day filled with work and activities. You grab your phone while you're still in bed, open one eye to check your texts and your emails, drag yourself out of bed, begin consuming enough caffeine to get you motivated to start the day, rush through the day with little time to pay attention to God or have meaningful connections with others, finish all the day's busyness, then lay your head down at night thinking about the list of things you didn't get done today or the things that you have to do tomorrow. That is sometimes the way that we live, right? Well, that's not what he's describing and explaining here. And so if we see that this is given prior to the law, prior to sin, you may say, well, the idea of Sabbath, that's just kind of Old Testament, and we don't have to live by that today. Like, we're not bound to obey that today. And I don't think it's worth arguing, at least in this context, whether this is lawful. So even if you take the approach where you say, I don't think this is law, I don't have to put myself under it, and you don't want to view Sabbath or taking a day of rest as a matter of law, I would encourage you to at least consider it as a matter of wisdom. And to realize that if God has embedded this into creation, and specifically if He's created us, our physical bodies, our minds, our emotions, and He's the one who's wired this in us to have this need, we're wise to consider that if we ignore this principle, we will suffer for it. If we honor this principle, we will be blessed for it. If you think of it this way, if you wanted to put a car together, build your own car, and you knew you kind of mechanically inclined, and there was one particular engine that you wanted to put in the car, and this engine was created by like this master mechanic. He builds this certain type of engine that you want in your vehicle, and so you order it, it comes in, you put this into your vehicle. And you've got the engine, it's running great. You go 2-3 weeks and you're driving your vehicle and the engine's doing great, but then you start noticing that it's not performing the way it should. That it's running a little bit sluggish, and you push the pedal down and it doesn't respond the way it should respond. And so you call the creator of the engine, the one who made it, the one who designed it, the one who built the engine, and he goes through a series of kind of diagnostic questions, this, and it comes to light that one of the things you've been doing with this awesome engine that you have is it's got a red line on it. And for you, red line is like that's where you start. And so everywhere you go, you've got to get there fast. You've got to be in a hurry. You've got to rush. And so you're spending the whole time with this engine at its red line, its peak capacity. And the designer, the creator, the one who's made this engine, who understands it better than anyone else, says to you, here's your problem. Here's the challenge. Yeah, you can redline your engine on occasionally. I've built it in such a way that it can withstand that pressure. But if you're constantly redlining, if you're constantly pushing it as hard and as fast as it can go, there are going to be negative consequences. Now, you as the owner of that engine, you're free to redline it all you want. Like, I've given you that autonomy and that it's yours. You can redline it all you want, but you just need to know there are going to be negative consequences if you do. The engine's not going to perform as well as it would otherwise. And your response to that mechanic, to the designer of that engine, would be to say, well, it's my engine, I'm just going to redline it anyway. Similar to us in our lives. If we say, well, I'm going to live my life and I'm going to fill my days and fill my weeks and I'm going to choose to engage in things because I've got to get a lot done and I've got kids and I've got this and I've got to get all this stuff done, it's really us saying to the maker, the creator, the designer of our physical engines, I'm going to do this anyway. And to that, I think he would say, you have the freedom. I mean, I think God really would say to us, like, he's given us the freedom to redline it as much as we want. What we see here is that if we do that, we should just know that we're going to miss out on a blessing, and we're really going to miss out on the way that he's designed us and wired us, ideally, to live. And so the question I think it's good for us to ask is, if both work and rest are part of God's created order, so he embedded that into creation, the question is this: are work and rest part of our created order? Are we intentionally setting aside, perhaps daily, perhaps weekly, are we setting aside times to Sabbath? Whether you look at it kind of from the legal standpoint with the law, or you say, well, no, I'm not under that, but are you setting aside times to intentionally rest? If God modeled it for us, the question for us is, are we mirroring what he modeled? And frankly, I think we've done a lot of work to sort of revise the Sabbath and to downplay the significance of it. And, at one time in our culture, there was these things called blue laws, and personally, I think we'd be a lot better off if some of those were in place today as a culture. But we've done a lot of things to sort of revise the Sabbath. But I think the main thing we need to do is to revive the Sabbath. Just to revive this sense of understanding God has put this principle, he's embedded it into creation, and we are wise if we heed it. We are foolish and misguided if we don't. And if we take this principle and we seek to live according to it, I mean, it's like anything in life. There's going to be struggles and challenges. But I think what we'll find is that if we embed this rhythm of Sabbath into our lives, what can happen is we can see that God is still in control, and we're not. And at the end of a time of rest, at the end of a time of frantically worrying, I'm not doing anything today, I'm not producing anything today, what we'll find is that while we're very significant to the lives of people around us, we're relatively insignificant to the operation of the entire world. And God is still able to control. He is still able to work, and life is still moving forward. Even if we're not producing and creating, we'll find if we practice intentional rest, we'll find that God's ways are really better than our ways. I think one of the things that lack of rest reveals is that if we're not resting, essentially what it reveals is that we're not trusting. And lack of rest is really a byproduct of lack of trust. Because if we're not resting, we're essentially saying, God, I don't trust that you can accomplish in that one day that I'm not doing anything. I don't trust that you can accomplish more in 6 days than I can in 7. And ultimately, this would be my prayer. It's my prayer for us, for you, for everybody, is that when we intentionally rest, we give ourselves the opportunity to be reminded that we are loved as human beings, not human doings. When you rest, when you set aside an intentional time to say, I'm squaring this away, this is going to be time that is devoted to God and to others, to meaningful connections, what happens is that we realize and we were reminded that God loves us just as we are. And we're not producing, we're not achieving, we're not earning, we're not striving, we're not doing anything, but right there in that moment of our rest, we are loved as much as we ever have been. And so if we want to incorporate this into our lives, there's 2 words that I want to give you and just ask you to kind of think about these and how these might apply to your life. There are 2 things essentially that we're going to have to do if we're going to move into this intentional rest. The first is that we're going to have to resist. Essentially resist the world's pull to always be on the go. We would probably agree that Jesus had a few important responsibilities when he was here on this earth. Like he had a big calling and a lot of weight, a lot of pressure, a lot of stress. And here's one of the things I noticed about Jesus. No less than 5 times do we find, as we read through the Gospels, that he disconnected himself from people, from responsibilities, in order to reconnect with God. There's one particular time in Mark, in the 6th chapter, and he had been through this season, he and his disciples, of like intense ministry, lots of pressure, lots of people coming to him. He had actually tried to get away with his disciples, and people followed him en masse, and this led to his feeding of the 5,000. And so Jesus is kind of at a point where he has worked, he has produced, and then he does something in verses 45 and 46 of Mark 6. And I want to read this to you, and the reason I want to read it to you is because I want you to read in these words your personal permission slip. I don't think it's healthy to read this as a to-do, or this is something I must make happen, not for the sake of pressure, but just to understand that the Sabbath and this idea of rest, it was made for you. God gave it to us as a gift. And here's what Jesus interacts with them in Mark chapter 6, verse 45. In this whole busy, intense time of ministry, it says, immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. This is after this time of ministry, and go ahead of him to the other side of Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. So Jesus kind of distances himself from his disciples, and he's about to distance himself from the people. And I want you to see what he does in verse 46. And again, this is your permission slip. In verse 46, after bidding them farewell. Can we all just say farewell together? Farewell. So you got this picture. Jesus, after bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain, not to work, not to achieve, not to produce, not to heal, not to teach, not to study, but to pray. Now, if we were Jesus' consultants, we would say, oh, Jesus, let's stop for a moment. You were at like this epic place in your ministry. The crowds are coming, they're following you, you're popular, you've just done these miracles. People are oohing and awing, and they're talking about you, and your name is reverberating throughout the whole region. Capitalize on this. Right? I mean, make this moment bigger, better, faster, cooler. I mean, really, Jesus, you need to lean into this. You need to maximize. Look at how God is using you. Jesus, you've got to do more. What does Jesus do? He says, farewell. See you later. I've got to go and be with my Father. Some of you are probably thinking, I would rest if people would leave me alone. Like I would rest if my boss wasn't constantly coming and saying, I want more from you. If your spouse wasn't pressuring you, more. If your kids weren't coming to you, your nieces, your nephews, your grandkids, saying, we want more. If your pastor wasn't standing here on a Sunday saying, be a contributor, not a consumer, more. So what can happen is we can blame our busyness. And we can say, my ability to rest, it's not in my control. My ability to rest and honor this idea that work and rest are part of God's created order. My ability to rest is really in the hands of other people. And you already know this, but if we do that, one thing that's true of people is people will take as much of you as you will give them. Your employer will take as much of you as you will give them. Your family, your kids. I mean, it's just true. Your coaches, your kids' coach. I mean, they will take as much of you as you will give them. And so if we live with this kind of reactive, where we're not in control, other people determine how we rest and how we work, we'll ultimately spend our lives never having Sabbath, never embedding this principle of both work and rest into the fabric, into the rhythm of our lives. And frankly, what you might need to do is to say farewell to some things, to resist some things. For you, it may be that you have to say farewell to working extra hours, to making a little more money so that you can get a little more ahead and get a little better vehicle or a little nicer house or whatever it is. It may be that you have to say farewell to your child being better than the other child at whatever activity or event they are engaged in. I say that with full and complete ownership that I want my kid to be the best at whatever they're going to do. But there really might be a need to say farewell to them winning a few more games or getting involved in another weekend tournament or a team that's going to constantly distract from your family unit together. I don't know what you might need to say farewell to, but I know this, for most of us, we do. And what I'd like to think is that, when I get older, this is going to get better. But here's what I'm told consistently. Like, I talk with a lot of guys that are retired, and it just doesn't change, does it? I mean, this incessant, this constant, this busyness, there's always this tendency to put ourselves toward work, work, work. So we have to, at some point, just resist the world's pull to always be on the go. The other thing that we will have to do, and the second word that I would give you, if we're going to rest, we must first resist. The second thing we must do is just to simply reset. To reset our schedule, to reset our calendar, to actually prioritize the things that mean most to us, the things that we have that are our deepest desires and our deepest values, that we establish what means the most to us, because if we don't, those things will be established for us. Our employers will determine those. Our kids' coaches will determine those. I mean, those things will get determined for us if we don't determine them ourselves. So we have to just reset our calendar and figure out, what does it look like for me to embed and to incorporate, to honor this rhythm of both work and rest into my life. And there's a man years ago named Rick Warren. I heard him say, it's always stuck with me. He said, in terms of like practical, what this can look like, he said, divert daily, withdraw weekly, and abandon annually. And whether you're a Rick Warren fan or not is really immaterial, but I've always thought that was fantastic advice. That every day we need to have, kind of in the rhythm of our day, an opportunity to divert. And we're going to take this summer, we're going to be in a series called Holy Habits. And much of this series is going to be about ways that we intentionally connect with Jesus. So we'll talk more about that later. But as we think about withdrawing weekly, that the Sabbath originally would have been a time that started sundown on Friday, would have went through Friday night, all through the day on Saturday, and then would have ended Saturday evening at sunset. And so for you, that may not be kind of the ideal time. It may be that the better day for you is a Sunday or some other time. But I would just encourage you to consider how you can reset your schedule, that every week you're saying this is a focused day for us to set aside as blessed and holy. It's not like every other day of the week. This is a day for me to reconnect in meaningful ways with people, to connect in meaningful ways with God, to do things, and I think this is key, to do things that aid our attention, that help us to be attentive to God and His presence with us. And so when we think about how we incorporate this into our lives, we do have to reset our schedules, reset our calendars. A couple of things that I think are just easy, kind of low-hanging fruit. One thing that we can reset and rest from is to take a break from technology. Work nowadays, it follows us home. It's like busyness is with us. Constant distraction, constant activity is with us via our phones 24/7. Interesting, I read recently that the majority of us check our phone every hour we are awake. And I don't know that the studies have been done, but I would say it's more like every 10 minutes we are awake. 59% of people check email as soon as it comes in, which leads to two different types of people. There are those who are prompt with email and those who never care about it, which leads to great sense of judgment and division, but we'll address that later. Listen to this. If you do this, would you just raise your hand? We just need to shame you for just a moment. 89% of people check email daily while on vacation. Don't raise your hand. Yeah, you can. On vacation? Over 80% of teenagers sleep with their phones. I would just encourage you to take a break, to divert daily, to withdraw weekly, to set that aside so that it's not a constant distraction, drawing your attention away from God and from others. There are a couple of, I think, indicators that we're sort of redlining, and you can figure out in your own life, but I know for us, one red line that I've noticed is that when we don't have time to have family meals together, it's probably an indicator that we're redlining. And there's a difference between a family meal where you gather and you're a family unit together. You're not just chasing one kid while he's off at an activity or an event. If you're not able to do that, it's probably an indicator. I know for us it's been that we're pushing probably a little bit too hard. Another is, and I can't do this one because it's part of my job, but for some of the rest of you it might be, or those of you who watch this later at home, another indicator that you can be redlining is that if you're not a part of a local church gathering on a regular basis, if you're consistently having to miss the worship of Jesus together with your local church, the point of this is not to turn this into kind of this legalistic, duty-oriented. The point of this is to remind ourselves that God has given this as a blessing. And we don't have to see it as this black and white, I'm terrible if I don't do this, or I'm really righteous and you're not righteous if you don't do this. It doesn't have to feed into that kind of the ego, but it's just a fresh, healthy awareness and reminder that God has given us this rhythm, that work and rest are part of His created order. Therefore, they should be part of my created order. He's given this to us as a blessing. And so in terms of what it is that you might do, setting aside this day, setting aside this time, just ask yourself, what are the things that help you pay attention to God? Again, we'll talk this summer about holy habits and a number of ways to do that, but just ask yourself that question and then organize and orient your life and your day around those things. What are the things that bring you joy? What are the things that bring you life? What are the things that give you a sense of connectedness with God? And then say, farewell. Farewell, farewell, farewell. For just perhaps the day, for just perhaps that 2 hours before you go to bed in the evening, for just that time where you say, the rhythm of my life is not going to be determined by other people. The rhythm of my life is not going to be, I'm not going to be known for busy, 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 busy. My identity, my ego is not going to be tied up in how much I'm accomplishing and whether people think I'm really productive or not. I'm going to let God, and this is the key, friends, we just let God determine the rhythm of our life. And when we get to that place where we care more about that connection with Him than we do about what other people say, we're able to live counterculturally. We're able to live in such a way that other people may not understand it. That's fine. You're not serving them. You're serving Jesus. That's the point. I think that we have freedom to detach ourselves from this constant busyness and honestly to exercise some type of load management. Whatever it needs to look like for you and for your family, if you're single, if you're at a place where you're empty nesters, don't know where exactly you are, but you're figuring out how to embed this pattern, this rhythm, this practice into your life. Both work and rest are part of God's created order. May they be part of ours as well. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for this day, this opportunity to worship together. And I just pray as we consider both work and rest, we would be attentive to the blessing that this holds we really would see it as something that is beneficial for us. And I know probably even as I say this leads to a host of questions and challenges and well, how will I do this and what about this? And I don't have answers for all of those things, but I pray that you would graciously and gently guide anyone here who senses that they're redlining. They're just kind of going at this pace where they're experiencing emotional stress and the byproducts of always being on the go physically, always tired and having issues resting inwardly. Spiritually, they're just not ever able to really be attentive. A day goes by, a week goes by, or longer, where really no thought has been given to abiding with Jesus. I just pray today that you guide us. In Jesus' great name we pray. Amen.